Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining. It is my absolute pleasure and honor to be chairing today's event and introducing Professor Maha Shuayb. My name is Dalal Taif. I am part of the Margaret Anstee Center for Global Studies, which is a research center based here at the college at Newnham. The center supports research into economic and social development and international relations in and relating to the Global South. The center currently supports 3 postdoctoral fellows, of which I am one, and 3 postgraduate students. The center was founded in 2018 thanks to the legacy of Dame Margaret Anstee, an alumna of the college and the first woman Undersecretary General of the United Nations. About today's lecture, so Professor Maha Shuayb is based at the Faculty of Education here at the University of Cambridge. She is also the director of the Center for Lebanese Studies, based in the History Department and also with another branch in Lebanon. She is a sociologist of education, interested in investigating education inequalities and the politics of education reform. For the past 12 years, she has been studying the evolving discourse around education of refugee children, such as emergency, as well as the education of refugees in longer-term settlements. Professor Maha Shuayb has conducted various quantitative and qualitative longitudinal research, and she is increasingly interested in understanding equitable research partnership, knowledge production, and research ethics between academic institutions and scholars in the global North and South. Her other research interests include disability studies, as well as history and civic education. She co-founded the Lebanese Association for History and the Disability Research and Advocacy Hub, which are housed at the Center for Lebanese Studies. Both initiatives aim to create collectives that bring together academics, practitioners, and policymakers to work together on these themes. She is also a member of the Research for Equitable Access and Learning REAL Center here at the University of Cambridge and the Center for the Study of Global Human Movements. About Professor Shuayb and her lecture today. So today's wide-ranging lecture will reflect on the question of disability in theory and practice. Professor Shuayb will explore how disability continues to be a marginalized field of study and politics, and how ableism persists as an unacknowledged axis of oppression, reinforced historically through eugenics, the medical model, and the complicity of the social sciences and humanities. She will be drawing on personal narratives and her decades-long educational and developmental research and work in Lebanon. The talk will examine how different spaces reproduce ableist frameworks and makes the case for disability justice as a transformative framework grounded in independent and intersectional coalition building. The floor is all yours. You just have to turn on your mic.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for being with us today and for those who are online. And thank you for the center for having me. Can you hear well? Is it okay? All right, great. So as Diala said, my research is actually not on disability usually, and it was an intentional decision, part of something that I will talk about today. But I've always been interested in inequality, injustice, marginalized groups. Today I will be reflecting on my journey as an academic with a disability navigating academia. But then as an academic, it's impossible to do this journey without centering it in academic literature and trying to theorize from this experience. So, so this is what I will be hoping to do today. First of all, so you also understand where I come from and my research okay, sorry. All right. So my positionality as a scholar, it's important because it will tell you a little bit more about how I also understand disability, but I also understand my research in general. So as a person who grew up in the south of Lebanon, born during the Israeli occupation of Lebanon and persisted living there until the liberation in 2000, I had an accident when I was 13, and as a result, I started to use a wheelchair. And all of this is against the context of war. So as a result, I had to self-study at home, and because the schools were not accessible at that time, and the idea of a person with disability going to school, it was a no-goer. I do remember, once, coming out of that experience, how people suddenly, the expectations from you had changed completely. What can you do as a woman? What can you do in terms of education? Suddenly I was given these detective stories, and I've never been a big fan of detective stories because like you can't go to school, you just can sit at home and read, you know. It's like, I'm not sure that's how it is. But that's also why the choice of topics that I wanted to study after hoping to come out of this forced exclusion is to be able to do something that would really address the oppression that I have experienced. But I didn't want to study disability at that time because I did not identify with the disability as an identity through that I could see it through an ableist lens, because that's what people were reflecting to me. And this is where I will take you to the next slide, and the construction of ableism. So I'll just give you an example starting from the purple cover. This is a book called The Violin Player or Violinist Player. And it's a book about, that I read before my accident, okay? And it's a book about a man who is really enchanted by the music that's being played by someone. He doesn't know who this person is. And so the whole story that goes on for over 60 pages is about him trying to find out who the woman is. And then the story finishes with the woman, him realizing that she uses a wheelchair. And the story ends there. There's no, path for this person. There's nothing about this person besides the fact that she plays music and she uses a wheelchair. So I remember as an 11-year-old crying and feeling really traumatized by this. And it's like, okay. And then I had my accident, and then someone who visits me after the accident gives me a collection of this very famous author in the Arab world, Mustafa Lutfi al-Manfaluti, was seen as a major thinker. And then in that book, there's a story about a father who goes to this author, and he tells him about his life and the fact that he has a child who is blind. So the author tells him, well, there's nothing I can do to really, lessen the pain that you have, because there's nothing that could be done, to lessen this unfortunate experience that no one can, cope with it. And I was like, wow, and then, I didn't accept it at that time. I was like, really? Is that what he really, how dare he could say this to this man? And so I was beginning to challenge how these ableist lenses and, how we see the world. Because, we're not born to see the world and disability this way. I have a son, and I could see how he sees the world, and I could see how his friends see the world, as a 1-year-old or 2-year-old. How do they understand disability or ableism? So, and then fast forward is in the middle, a book by Ilyas Khouri. For those in the Arab world, they know a lot about Ilyas Khouri, but he's also a revolutionary and very radical activist, but also author who wrote lots of books like the Sun, Bab al-Shams, which is the son of In the Eye of the Sun, and many other books that are very well known. And I'm sitting with him. He passed away, unfortunately. And I was very tempted to write this article after he passed away, but then I thought maybe it's not the best thing to do because he was such an ableist person. Sitting with him on a table during dinner, and this is like a few years ago, and he's talking about, again, for him, he's anchored in ableism. And ableism is nothing there's nothing you can do to overcome it. One of his characters in Bab al-Shams is the limper. She has no name, she has no character besides the fact that she limps. And then, when you sit and talk to him, even that he can say I'm a wheelchair user, but he can still say the most ableist thing. And I'm thinking, like, how could you be such a radical person and revolutionary, and you want to liberate here and there, but you can't see disability as a site of liberation? So, this is why I wanted to talk about radical scholarship. But okay, I'm just going to. So yeah, in the beginning, for me, it was like a complete rejection of the identity disabled. So I didn't want to study disability. I didn't want to be identified as a person with disability. And then I started to think, okay, there's something beyond that. And now I think I've reconciled. And now, 30 years later, I can talk and do this presentation about disability because it kept coming all the time. So when I came as a student in 2001 to Cambridge, I remember being received by someone from my college at the train station, and then they took me to like a care home or an institution because they thought, oh, we can't accommodate you in the college. So would you want to come and stay there? And I was like, seriously, you think I came all the way from Lebanon to go into this care home for students? I was like, no way. So then, they showed me the college, and it was actually very accessible. But in their head and in their mind, they couldn't see that it's a person who can stay and live alone, even if you use a wheelchair. Fast forward 20 years later, or even less, I come as a faculty. And then the accommodation for staff. I mean, disability for students have moved so much, but for staff, they still don't understand that staff have disabilities. So I stayed on the list of accommodation for 3 years, no accommodation, but also the layers of discrimination. If there's an accommodation, they don't expect you to have family. Or, so you see all the different layers. When I got a fellowship at Oxford, they had student accommodation and fellows. The student accommodation was accessible, but the fellows were not. And so I stayed with a student, had a great time, which was lovely. But still, you could see the inherited bias that was still in academia. And when I was, the first talk I gave as a chair at the faculty, I was presented as someone who, the person who was presenting me, I had bumped into them the first time in a bus. And my son was sleeping, he was 4 years old at that time. So, and I had a bag to carry, and then this person offered to help off the bus. And then comes this first presentation to the audience, and this person presents me as, the first time I met Maha is when I helped her off the bus. And then it's that rhetoric of help, but not who this person credentials is. And then you see, I thought like, wow, still in academia, there's so much ableism that is happening. And you still attend conferences on disability that have no one with disability in them. And, and most of the scholars, I'm not saying only person with disability need to study disability, or men need to study, or, only women need to study women or gender, but, there is something bigger here. So, so now I could say, yes, I claim this identity, but there's a side for assured resistance against oppression with other groups such as racism, etc., etc. Okay, and so I would say I would embed my scholarship in what I would call radical scholarship, and I'll tell you why this is important. Oops, sorry. Because I defined myself as in my scholarship being embedded in radical scholarship. And then when I left to Lebanon and went to Lebanon after 12 years of living here and working, and I thought like, wow, let's hang out with the radical circles of Lebanon. And then it's the shock of my life. It's like, hello, ableist comrades, like ableism to the maximum, even in the very radical spaces that's supposed to be aware of power, of oppression, etc. And then I started reading more about this radical scholarship and how they would see, like, even intersectionality, for God's sake. When they first set it up, they spoke about all identities except disability. Only later on that disability becomes part of intersectionality. Judith Butler, her whole theory, you could just remove the word queer and put disability, and it would speak exactly the same. But she doesn't talk about disability. And actually someone did call upon her and say, why didn't you make the links? And her argument was like, well, I leave it to the others to do. And that's why I will come back to the issue of solidarity. I mean, now with Palestine, we're asking people to take a consistent position of oppression. You can't talk about race or gender, but then don't talk about Palestine. The same thing. You can't talk about queer and not talk about disability. And actually, she did in the end a movie with a disability activist, which I wouldn't say is the best, but even radical scholars in their discussion of their scholars, they actually don't even make it present that many of these people had disabilities, but maybe probably because disability wasn't an identity at that time as it is now. My colleague Layla Kadewal argues that it's probably because people don't want to acknowledge the privilege you have by being someone without a disability. So you are benefiting from an ableist system, but you don't want to talk about that privilege. So, maybe that it's actually still seen as a negative thing that you want to stay away from it as much as you can. But the thing is, just to give you a bit of idea also in terms of statistics, so staff within academia who have disability are still a very, very small minority compared, obviously, those who disclose their disability, because there are many who don't disclose their disability. And I think statistics have changed significantly once mental health became part of our definition of disability. So you would see how with the students, now we have more disabled students, but we haven't caught up in terms of staff. But what I think is super interesting is the number of gender program, for example, compared to disability studies. So we have over 100 in England and only 7 programs on disability. Now, those exclude special education, okay, which we will come to it later. So even as a field, it's still a very, very undermined field. But academia is complicit, and this is why I think it has to do, we have to put it really into account, accountable here, because the whole notion of disability was, written, and it came from research and science. It came first from eugenics, the idea of normal, that was all developed inside academia by scientists that made the normal and the abnormal. And by the way, it went hand in hand with race. Again, this is a more fit race, this is a less fit. But we rarely, in racism, we rarely do this kind of pearl. It's the same supremacy, but one is on color and the other is on, what is the standard body. So then this hierarchy gets constructed. And as a result, actions are, first of all, the institutionalization of persons with disability was the norm, and now we're trying to push beyond the institutionalization. In Lebanon, unfortunately, we're seeing another push for institutionalization, and with the gender and the idea of who will do the care if we do deinstitutionalize, because women will end up doing the care. So then there's no, let's keep it as it is, so you would see all these hierarchies of oppression playing against each other. But now we take it for granted that we have able-bodied people, less able, and disability. And, And social sciences wasn't even better at all. So although in sociology we talk a lot about politics, power, etc., this was never taken into disability as a side. They actually took for granted the fact that we have this group called disabled. They adopted with the same supremacy lens, and they kept approaching this group from a productivity lens, just as capitalism and Marxism did, and implemented it on what these people can do or what are they worth in relation to how productive they are. So, so many of the theories in social sciences are inherited in ableism. And even when they tried to address it, unfortunately, it didn't work out, and we will discuss a bit more. So then we see social scientists begin to engage with the field of disability, and then what do they develop? They develop the medical model, which obviously sees these people as sick, who needs to be recovered and healed and cured. Then, there's a revolution that happens. We have the social model that says, no, it's not, we don't need to cure these people, but we need to make the environment more accessible. But again, it's not about power, it's not about politics, it's about inclusion. Now, if I replace the word inclusion with apartheid, you'd see how it looks like. But if you are a person with disability trying to access many things, the word looks to you like it's an apartheid. And every day it's like, oh, you can go to this floor, but the other one you can't, because that's how far you can go. So the way you experience it is it's an apartheid. But in the work we do, we don't ever use that kind of political language, which I think it sanitizes how we look at disability as a structural, like it's a ramp issue or it's a toilet issue. It's not about actually I've assigned to you an identity that is far less, but it's more inferior than other persons. And then the rights-based approach came, and again, it's all about changing laws and legislations, which is great, but still it didn't address the issue of power and ableism. And most importantly, it took any politics out of this debate. And in development studies, development is not the most radical field, of course, with all due respect, but so it was naturally going to adopt the same logic of it's a group vulnerable group, very disadvantaged, that we need to care for. And the whole logic of when you start from a supremacist angle, you're doing charity. At best, you're doing charity. And as a result, you really depoliticize this group, and you also make it more of an individual identity in the liberal sense of identity as race, etc., sometimes seen as a non-political. So what do we need to do? We need to improve the service provisions, inclusion, welfare, humanitarian. And by the way, we do this not just for disabled people because they are different. We do it exactly in my field at refugees. We do exactly the same for refugees. They are a lesser group with lesser rights, and it's about how much charity we can give them. So it's about power, and this is why I think it's a question of power and privilege. So we see very limited political research, but also most of the work that is done by able-bodied people. There's a famous slogan, "Nothing about us without us." I would say is almost most of the things are about us without us. So. But what I think is very alarming is, and which I'll give an example from Lebanon, is what this, so I didn't say before that most of the literature I'm calling on is Western literature. So I'm embedding my talk in Western literature. But when you see what was happening in other world and how this knowledge or epistemology of ableism gets exported to the global south or to certain countries, how it really messes around the system. So disability organization became more and more apoliticized. It's about services, it's about charity, and it's about inclusion. Okay, so when we look at research, as I showed you, there's very limited anyway research on disability studies, and there are 100 special educational programs. So the paradigm that we look at disability learning difficulties, again, I'm not undermining. I mean, I have my issues with the whole field, but that it tells you how academia is interested in looking at these people. It's not interested in looking at really interrogating the power within this notion of disability, but how we can make them fit and include them more, It makes us feel better, but also, if we have kids who have this, special education, we might, want to pay more attention to this. But still, it doesn't look at the issue from the heart causes of its ableist construction. So, for instance, in Lebanon, you look at, are there any sociologists who work on disability? None. We did a scholarship trying to recruit PhD students. Hardly any we've had. So the whole, I remember doing once a meeting when we wanted to create the Disability Hub, and we invited many academics and disability activists and scholars. And I remember one particular academic who walked in and said, "Oh, no, that's not the kind of disability I thought of." And he walked out of the room. He wanted mental health disability. So, so it's also, now that mental health is a fashionable part of disability, by the way. And this is why the conservatives went calling on disability benefits suddenly increasing in England, etc. So, but academics, it's not a sexy topic. It's not like a gender or queer or race. I mean, look at EDI committees. We talk about race, we don't talk about disability often, etc. So there is this hierarchy of oppression. And Western funding in development is also geared to the same saviorist charity model that we want to do, ramps, inclusion, toilets, etc., or prevention of disability. That's the other thing, is you want to prevent disability. And so there's a lot of money being invested in medical work that's happening in the global south around the prevention of blindness, etc., which I'm not saying I'm against, but I'm saying it's interesting that we don't as well invest in research on social and political science in this. But also there's a question of who's doing the research, which really brings, I remember being asked to chair a panel on the voices of persons with disability. So the speakers were all able-bodied people who have done research. And because the research ethics identifies persons with disability as being super vulnerable, they could not get or did not want to get permission to speak to the persons with disabilities. So they spoke to their carer or whoever is responsible for this person, something like. Shall we change the title of the presentation? This is not a panel on voice, but how research ethics is used to amplify the idea these are vulnerable groups, so we can't research. So now, even when There was a war in Lebanon last year, and we wanted to look at the impact of the war on persons with disabilities. Oh, no. They're vulnerable groups. You can talk to the parents, but you can't talk to them. So getting the research ethics approved becomes more and more difficult. And if you're a researcher who doesn't want to go into all of the complexities of this, you're probably going to give up. But it's so interesting how we institutionalize this ableism within the bureaucracy of the university. So obviously there's been a lot of critique to this, these ways of thinking, and disability justice is a new framework that has been created by persons with disabilities who wanted to bring, for them, this was a site of struggle, a political struggle that is common across all the other groups, race, sexuality, gender, etc. So for them, also the idea of interdependence has to come over the idea of vulnerability. And they give the example of COVID. During COVID, if we learned anything, is we cannot live without each other. We are interdependent on each other. So the idea of we will never be vulnerable, or some people are less vulnerable than others, has been put into question, because many of us are vulnerable at one stage or another of our lives, but also we cannot live without help from and support from each other. So why only label and stigmatize certain people as needing the help and others as not? So they came up with this disability justice framework, and it's still an emerging work that is challenging the whole ableist notion of that often disability studies, and you probably see like the CRIP theory and other. This is all part of reclaiming the identity of disability as a political and site of struggle. Okay, so I'll give you an example on Lebanon of how when you export this Western epistemology of disability, you really mess up things. So in Lebanon, we had a disability movement that started to become more and more active during the 80s, in the middle of the Civil War. And what was, and this, by the way, happened as a coincidence, this research. We were doing a study on social movements in Lebanon, and we decided to code this database by all the vulnerable groups that we never usually look into their mobilization. So women, domestic workers, disability, etc. And what was interesting is when we were studying this movement, first of all, we noticed that persons with disabilities were present almost in most of the other groups' protests, but that you can't say the same about the other one. You can't say feminists going into the disability protest. And what was also so remarkable, it was super political. They were marching. The first march they did was from the extreme north to the south. It took them 4 days of marching. And what they were protesting for end of the Civil War, for social cohesion, for political reform, for ending the war. And it was like, wow, I mean, feminists didn't do that. So it was interesting that persons with disabilities were doing this movement. So, but their understanding of disability was very different. But then it started to change. We started to have more and more development after the war came, and there were similar things to the CRIP camp that started to happen in Lebanon. And then we see similar models being imported into the country. So now, I think 10 years ago, there was one of the Silvana Lais, a very prominent disability activist, decided to make a protest, a political protest, because of a government gridlock at that time. So she goes to the airport and where the politicians are coming from Qatar, and then she makes a protest with other colleagues. And then she was attacked. Like, it's none of your business to talk politics. Why are you talking about the government lockdown? You are a disability activist, you talk about disability. So you see how now you cannot anymore protest other things. You just have to protest in your own area. So her response was like, no, yes, we have disabilities, but we are members of the society, and it matters to us the government is, whatever political position she had. So, but it becomes a very siloed identity. And another study we did of civil society showed that most of them were just become service providers for the big INGOs. And also you have the hierarchy of NGOs, the disability NGOs as well, those who receive a lot of funding, those in the rural versus, I mean, it's not a homogeneous movement as well, but it's very interesting how it becomes so depoliticized and so much about charity as well. So to come to the conclusion, I don't know how many of you know the work of Alice Wong, but unfortunately she passed away. But she was trying to make the linkages between we are not individual identities. Our struggle is interconnected. So you can't talk about race without talking about colonization. You can't talk about disability without talking about occupation or racism or etc. So, and she was really trying to point out to the issue of liberal identity politics, where each of us have to mind his own business in your own identity and category and stick to it. And that applies to us as academics. I mean, now it's the era of all of us are reclaiming positivism suddenly, because it's so comfortable. It helps you stay away and distance yourself from the real world. And you can say, oh, I'm a scientist. I have nothing to do with daily politics. So, and I'm neutral, which is all obviously, there's nothing neutral about it. So, and that identity politics become an oppression Olympics, as we know, who needs to get the resources and who needs to get the visibility in EDI. We see it a lot. And then we stop talking about, we only talk about our individual demands, our siloed demands. And again, it's about, in my view, services, charity, etc. It's not a political struggle. And then we're not allowed to do solidarity with each other. And that, I think, is the most critical issue. So I think anti-oppression ethics demand from us a coherence across all cases of systematic violence. We can't say, oh, I'm pro this. It's like, I'm pro X, but I'm anti this. You can't. If your ethics is justice and anti-oppression, then you have to be consistent across the different groups. And that's why, at the moment, I think for disability movement, this is even more important because they're almost on their own. It's one of the least popular issues beyond service and charity as a political mobilization. If you go to Lebanon, it's beginning to get better, but generally disability is, they are on their own in terms of as a disability movement. And I think more and more needs to be done in that sense. So to conclude, so we often talk about reparation in relation to racism and many other things. I think there is a need, academia is required and has a lot to answer for in terms of its complicity in creating ableism, benefiting from ableism, and we need to start talking about reparation. And disability research and development, I mean, there's a lot to be said and done in terms of the research on disability, but also what worries me, even if you a researcher with disability, often you co-opt the discourse. And don't forget there's if we're all complaining about funding that goes into disability studies or disability work is very limited. So you are fighting for breadcrumbs. And as a result, you need to align yourself with the general discourse. Otherwise, you're going to be left alone. But that's why solidarity is super important, because I often find disability researchers and scholars claiming the same discourse, ableist, because they need to live and survive. So I'm just going to finish, with these few points. And this is why I think any hope for us to move rests in the notion of solidarity. Thank you very much.